Welcome to Backyard Oasis, a podcast designed by and for older adults living in the beautiful Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts and produced in the tech studios at Greenfield Community College in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Backyard Oasis reaches out to older adults who seek knowledge to help them live more thoughtfully, healthily, and happily, who hope to inspire others with their ideas, and who serve their communities in the interest of the greater good.
Hey everybody, this is Judy Raper, Associate Dean of Community Engagement at Greenfield Community College, and I'm here with a few of my colleagues today to talk about the incredible documentary Join or Die. So I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves before I tell you a little bit about this film in case you haven't seen it yourself.
Hi, I'm Samantha Wood. I'm the Director of Strategic Innovation for Workforce Development at Greenfield Community College. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, and I'm Audette. I'm the audiovisual technician at Greenfield Community College. Also happy to be here.
And you may recognize Alex as my producer from all my reality TV podcasts, and now you'll be able to see the range that I have, that I can also talk about serious topics.
That's right. She got the producer on mic. It's tough to do.
So we're here today to talk about the documentary Join or Die. And this documentary examines social scientist Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone and his theory of how declining community engagement created an American civic crisis. He traces our civic engagement back to the 50s and makes the connection between a decline in joining clubs and organizations that began in the 60s and the waning of our democracy. He further connects this decline to technological evolution, which began with the television. He studied regional governments in Italy and discovered the common thread that ran through effective governments was a strong social fabric. At the heart of his work is the idea that we can save democracy by becoming joiners, as it is through these associations that we encounter and connect with people we wouldn't otherwise come across, hopefully reducing our partisan divide and enabling us to hold our government accountable to working for the people. And we will be showing this documentary March 24th, which is a Monday night at 6 p.m. at the Garden Theater. One of the directors will actually be with us afterwards for a Q&A, and this is co-sponsored by FRCOG, which stands for the Franklin Regional Council of Governance. So with that sort of intro about the film, I just like to start with what we thought of it.
So, Judy, what'd you think of it?
Oh, I'm going to start?
Yep.
I get to go first? So I forget how this film came to my attention. I got some email, and when I saw the content, I immediately knew I wanted to watch it. I watched it, I think, the same night I got the email. And I had some familiarity with Robert Putnam's work. I remember the book Bowling Alone back in the 90s. I don't even recall if I read it. I don't think I did. But as soon as I watched the film, like pretty much everything resonated for me. It was just, I found the research really compelling. I found the theory around our decline in civic engagement being related to our struggles with preserving our democracy to be extremely true from my observations and from everything I've researched and read. And I think for me it felt like a relief that somebody was talking about this. Ironically, when he wrote Bowling Alone, I was working on my dissertation at the University of Vermont. And I am in no way suggesting my genius matches Robert Putnam's. However, so much of what he talks about, I talked about in my dissertation, and I'll talk a little bit later about why I included that in my dissertation. But it really resonated with me in terms of my personal life and my professional life, and I loved every minute of it. And I've watched it now 4 times because I feel like I catch something new every time I watch it. So I will probably continue to rewatch it.
So there are a lot of points in this movie that really resonate for me. Before I came to a career in higher ed, I worked for close to 2 decades in local journalism here in Western Mass. And watching the decline in local journalism nationally has raised a number of issues that are in alignment with Robert Putnam's research, in terms of community engagement, in terms of how people happen into relationships with one another because of common interests, and the sort of the wonderful serendipity of running into people on the street. And I think the decline of local retail is also part of this, the opportunities we have for running into one another, and the wonderful things that come out of that around projects or community organizing or fundraising or civic events. in local journalism, a lot of the reason we covered stories was so people would know where to bring the casserole when someone needed it. You know, when there's a house fire and people would, I was a newsroom editor, and people would say, like, why are you covering these horrible things? It's not fair to the family. And I would say, I understand that criticism, and we treat people with dignity at the same time. People need to know how to help. And so seeing this film, and I think it's masterfully done, is really comes full circle for me with that work.
I just want to respond to the part about journalism, because I was looking for my grandfather's obituary the other day, which I was unable to find, but I ended up finding like newspapers that were printed in the city where he lived around the time that he was alive. And I was so struck by, and I've seen this before, but I was so struck by the information that used to be shared in newspapers around what was going on in the community. Like there would be things about, you know, somebody went to visit their aunt in Toronto and somebody has a sickness in their family, and just the way in which, I mean, it's sort of like Facebook now or social media now. They were sharing information, but it was with the intention of bringing people together and also alerting community members to who had needs that other folks could help out with. I was so struck by that. Anyway, okay, Alex, you want to jump in?
I do. Sorry about that. Yeah. Just a quick mic adjustment for Judy. Yeah, I think I might have walked away from the film itself with maybe slightly more mixed feelings, I suppose, about maybe the way the message was delivered. Like the urgent, I guess maybe I didn't feel like it met the urgency of the moment in terms of the kind of like explicit politics of what's going on. And I think I took, and again, I'm not approaching this as any sort of scientist, right? So these are all just words, but the continued use of social capital, right? Just like the applying capitalism to everything, including the way that we interact with each other, treating everything as an exchange, everything as like as a transaction, I think is something that I just bump into a lot when I watch movies like this that are calls to action. They all tend to be framed within a system that I believe doesn't really work for us. However, I think the movie does ultimately kind of have the right idea, right? Which is just like, we all need to be meeting in person and talking in person about our shared interests. And I think like it really is kind of as simple as that. And I was a little disappointed to see very little mention of the effects of like social media, the way people tend to only communicate online. There were little bits here and there, mostly about the positive ways it can be used, like meeting on Facebook or talking on Facebook, and how that can be non-productive ultimately. But I think there wasn't as much examination of how we've just migrated there, and rather than trying to seek each other out. Exactly, join clubs specifically in the parlance of the movie, right? And I do think clubs specifically can be an answer, right? Like if we talk about like, some of the most powerful organized labor movements have kind of started as clubs. They talk about unions very briefly. Another one of my sort of things is like, I think they spent 90 seconds total in the film talking about unions. So yeah, I think like there was a lot of great takeaways, like as far as, and I do have to say Robert Putnam is just like an amazing character and subject of the film in every way. And he's very compelling, and like you can see that he really believes in not just his work, right, but like humanity, and that's very contagious. And so it did make me want to read his books.
I'm reading one of them right now. I'm reading his most recent one right now.
Oh, cool.
The title's escaping me, but yeah.
Is it The Upswing?
Yes.
Alex, I want to ask you a question. If you had a different way of saying what I think some of what the meaning is behind how he uses social capital, I would love to know how you would phrase it.
Yeah. Well, I think we would just need to completely separate our interactions with one another from any form of capital or any form of transaction, right? Like bonds, you know, we can like use those sort of words rather than like our actual like value to the community, because that's what capital is, right? Like, and yeah, let's see if I can go over some of my one interesting like note that I took, like, so a lot of the data was super interesting, right? And he touches on how a lot of his data on social gatherings was only collected by marketing agencies to sell stuff back to us, right? So it's like we already detect sort of maybe subconsciously that in our society we are the product, right? And so we continue to so we see each other as products, right? And right down to our political affiliation, we start to see each other as products of D's or R's next to our name, right? And relying on a concept of social capital only reinforces that. So what happens is you see like half of the country's social capital is being at an all-time low right now, right? Because like people can't stand one half of the country because they see political parties as a social group now. So yeah, it's like, and unlike, I have a little note here. So unlike market capital, you don't buy social capital low. You like, right? So like, it's at an all-time low right now. So people really aren't trying to go talk to each other right now. And because we see things as social capital, as transactional, what have you done for the community and what can I do for you? And we'll keep it working that way. So yeah, I would see it as just like, as a social, like we're forced into this life together. We're not forced into it, but we get to live in this community together. And I think like it's just social life. It's social bonding. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I wish I did have more language to like put something new on it, but I don't. And I think the movie was very framed in social capital specifically, though. And I think that was part of my problem with it, you know?
I wonder if it's because I've used that term a lot. Actually, I use it in a lot of my teaching. And I've never thought of it the way you're describing it, but I can understand your objections or your concerns about it, because I think of social capital, like I always talk about how I believe, and research bears this out, but that good relationships lead to good work. So, I mean, Sam, you work on a very connected team in workforce development, and you do amazing work. And I'm sure part of that could be attributed to the relationships and bonds that you have with each other. So
yeah, I would say that those relationships are not even with each other, but the way I see my peers interacting with the community makes me want to work like that. It's really a positive reinforcement.
So I think, but I guess what I was thinking about was I see social capital as using relationships to solve problems, and that we do a better job of solving problems when we're connected. And so I can see how the word capital sounds super transactional and maybe not applicable. So do you think your objection is the word versus the concept, or?
No, I think even when they were in their little animation montage explaining social capital, they explain a transaction. You know, they explain helping someone in your community, so they are more likely to help you.
The mutual reciprocity.
Yeah, of course, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
That does make sense. But like, I think, I don't know. Again, like you're so much more educated than I am on this. Like you have, right? Like you've written like dissertations on stuff like in related, like, and so I am just like fascinated to hear, like, I know that social capital is like a phrase that's been, like they say in the movie, it's been rephrased 3 to 4 times over the course of 100 years. But that's about as long as American capitalism has sort of been around as we know it. Right. So like, I think there is an association between the two. But I can also understand like where you're coming from with it, which is like, and I can accept that for this conversation. Absolutely. Like that, it wasn't necessarily meant that way in the film. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
but yeah,
absolutely. What, so when and Sam, you got into this a little bit when you talked about your career in journalism, but how have you seen the concepts that were presented in this documentary show up in your personal and professional life? Were you able to sort of relate it to your own life and your own observations?
Oh yeah, very much so. So I was born in 1969. I'm very much of a generation that said I'm not much of a joiner, and did not. I did not have an affiliation. My family was not affiliated with a religious organization when I was growing up, for instance. Even though I come from a Jewish family, my mother had decided that she didn't want to be a practicing Jew and was very interested in Unitarianism. But I was I refused to be associated with that. And I think it had more to do with needing to assert myself as a young person. And then my affiliations were social or musical or based in the arts at that point. And so I wasn't without association. I just didn't join formal organizations, except for, I will say, I was a member of the Future Farmers of America and was both attracted and repelled by how organized, very organized that national organization works. And they have, they use Robert's Rules of Orders in their meetings. And
Oh, wow.
that was the first time I'd been exposed to that. And now I understand it's like really important to know how to run a meeting when you're trying to get something done with a lot of people. And it's great to have a common process. And now there are other processes that people have developed to perhaps encourage a different kind of participation. But so I was not much of a joiner, but as I got older and I went to work in a newsroom and had a different kind of a critical mindset, I began to have to edit stories about how there weren't enough people helping to run local governments, how there is a decline in the number of volunteer firefighters, and communities need volunteer firefighters. If you don't have a fire department, you can't get insurance for the homes in your community. So there are a lot of structures that are and interdependent with one another that if we disengage civically, they will fall apart. And then, of course, it's been shown that if reporters don't show up to meetings, it's more likely that either there will either be a rise in corruption or there'll just be a rise in mismanagement. And so having good, engaged local journalism at every level helps to create structures that are more accountable and more responsible.
Can you say that last part again? You said if journalists don't show up to meetings, there's a possibility of increased corruption?
There is documented increases in misuse of
because
public
it's not being
funds.
recorded, because
There's less scrutiny there, and if public officials don't have to answer questions, it's not just that they tend to be more corrupt, it's that more errors are made. A simple example of that is that in a local newsroom, part of our job every year was to go through every fiscal budget, every municipal budget. Reporters would come back from town meetings with a copy of the budget, and we would go through it, and they would be reporting on this line item or that line item. And people would come to my desk and say, can you double read this? I think there's an error. And sure enough, there would be some kind of a mathematical error in the budget. And the reporter would go back to their desk and they would call the person who had made that budget for that town or had contributed to that. And they'd say, oh my goodness, thank you so much for catching it. So human error itself is just a fact of life.
Right.
People will make mistakes, and without eyes on them, more eyes on them, there'll be more mistakes. So even a lack of number of bodies in the room will contribute to a decline in good governance, whether it's by an active, bribery or some kind of malfeasance, or just not enough folks to take care of things.
And do you think local journalists have more freedom than those that are like the legacy media that's reporting about the country?
So I think of local journalism as legacy media.
Okay.
So it used to be that there were local newspapers all over the place, and they did the on-the-ground reporting that would be the source of news for TV stations, for instance. And the people who came up in small local papers, if they were really good, they would go on to bigger papers in other larger municipalities, or they would stay and they would do excellent reporting, but hopefully rise through the ranks of their small papers. As that has disintegrated, there's been a loss of that skill set.
Wow. Well, and I think just the, and I even find this for myself. I think the challenges around discerning truth from fiction in terms of reporting has become like, there's so many folks, like what you talked about, like the impact of social media and the internet and so forth. There's so many folks reporting on there, and sometimes and some really good independent journalism, some excellent independent journalism. But obviously, some of the conspiracy theories and so forth have come from folks who sort of almost pose as, and the impact that's had on the fraying of our fabric, as socially as a society, is really, really concerning. Like if we can no longer trust. Yeah. What about you, Alex? What did you?
Like, how have I seen the effect?
Yeah, how is it relatable to you?
Oh, man. I think that's the element where I had to do the most, self-examination while watching the film, right? Because I don't think it's limited to your generation, right? Like I definitely am a part of that. Like, oh no, I don't really see myself as a joiner, right? And I think and the movie touches on that. Like, we've been pushed into an incredibly individualistic society, right? Like we're all sort of like forced into this bootstraps individualist sort of mindset, and it does feel I feel disconnected from the community. Less so in Greenfield, I have to say, since we moved here 4 years ago from the Boston area. I think in 2 years in Greenfield, I met more people and made more connections than 10 years in Boston. And I think there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of reasons for that. But like, I think Greenfield does have a special sauce to it. Franklin County, the Valley, the Pioneer Valley area, all of this whole area. I do think there's a bond here. There is like a social fabric here that I feel more so than where I grew up in Rhode Island, more so than anywhere I've lived. So that's kind of what keeps us here. But still, it's like hard to just like, it feels hard. In the morning, it feels hard to find a club to go to. And then in the afternoon, it feels hard to go to that club. Once you've done all your research and found it because you've worked all day or you have a kid at home or whatever reason, So I think like going back to social media, part of that for someone like me who is like, I'm not on any social media by choice. I try to.
Oh, really? None?
Yeah, no, none.
Wow.
Well, I guess I can't say that, like, because like a lot of things that we might not traditionally. I think a lot of websites that we might not, like YouTube is a social media website, and I do watch stuff on YouTube. Or
but you're not sharing about yourself on.
No, I don't have any Facebook profile, for example, or anything like that. And most social sort of, it seems like aside from some flyering out around town, that's how you find out about stuff, is through an Instagram or a TikTok or whatever. And without that, it's very alienating, sort of like, and so in an attempt to get away from all the toxicity of social media and the way people can behave on there, ultimately it just kind of makes it a little bit harder to find stuff. So then I kind of do eventually by walking around town or whatever, and then I'm just wiped out, man.
Yeah, no, I think
and also we have very social jobs.
We do.
So like
we do.
I think sometimes at the end of the day, we've been a little tapped out of our conversational ability. You know what I mean? It's hard to be like engaged all day sometimes, and then especially in a club, I think it can feel a little intimidating sometimes, because if you're in that room, presumably it's because there's a part of you in that room, right? Like if it's like a music club or something, if like I'm there saying I'm here because I'm interested in this thing, that's a part of my soul, right? And you're meeting people who share a part of that with you. And so it's vulnerable. And so like, I think something the movie touched on, but again, not enough for me, is like that the drain we all feel, I think, is what's part of what, like, it can be hard to find a place to go to. And then once you find it, it's like, is it just going to make my day harder to go? And ultimately, I generally, whenever I do get myself out, I never regret it.
Right. It's making yourself go.
Exactly. It's kind of making yourself go. And I think that's a tough puzzle to solve. How do we all kind of make ourselves feel a little more vital again, But
I wonder where they used to find time to go to clubs and organizations, because they used to.
You work even longer hours, right? Well, I think a lot of it used to be trade union meetings after work, stuff like that. Like, I think a lot of it is political action. They talk about like some of Frederick Douglass's like famous speeches were given like the anti-slavery ladies sewing society or something, which was an incredible little like factoid. And like, so that's where I think like that's where I think the movie is really on to something, is like clubs, like when it clicks and you find the right people around you, it's not just a door to sewing. It can be a door to abolition,
Right.
So
when you mentioned individualism, I was thinking about that part in the film where I can't remember her name, but there was someone who talked about her belief that it was intentional, that it was actually designed to push back on the civil rights movement because they were making too much progress.
The union organizer talked about how she felt, during the era of suburbanization that there was a real push to individualism in an effort to crack unions. And I think there's a lot of merit to that line of reasoning. Absolutely.
It's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, and I think that the dissolution of unions has led to this sort of more of this push on to the individual as though they are to create all the benefits of society themselves, which is impossible. But I do think it was intentionally union busting in this country.
Yeah, don't be in the union, be the CEO, right? Like a new push to be the entrepreneur. Like we can all be the CEO now, that's the new drive in American society. It feels
I had not even thought about this till now, but I was like, because in my own life, and I'm just 5 years older than Sam, and I grew up in a different geographic area. I grew up in Indiana. But what resonated with me, and I was surprised when he talked about the decline in joining starting in the 60s, because I felt like I grew up in a time where we were part of everything. My parents were always in a bowling league. And now that you mentioned unions, my parents were both extremely active union members. My mother was a teacher, so she was in a teachers union. My grandmother was in the Teamsters. I'd never met her, but she worked for them. And then my father was United Auto Workers. And we went to union camp when I was a kid. We sang union songs. And I hadn't really thought about that because I always think about, in terms of my own childhood and my most important relationships and connectedness came from my neighborhood. Our neighborhood was extremely tight. I have such fond memories of the blizzard of 77 or 78 because 7 or 8 families, we spent the whole week together. We rotated houses. One of the men in the group owned the local liquor store, so all the men would get the sled and go to the liquor store and bring back, and I always associated liquor with fun because all the adults were much more fun when they were drinking. My mom had card club every month where the women came together to play cards, and there was always great snacks. We spent tons of time at the skating rink, the mall. I was in gymnastics and tap dance and swimming and everything. And so I felt like I took that all for granted growing up. But I can remember my parents were super strict, so I couldn't ride my bike around the neighborhood till I was way older than you would think. But I remember going around the neighborhood thinking, I know who lives there. I know who lives there. I feel safe because if I have a problem, I know where to go, which I don't think is true in a lot of neighborhoods today. All that said, I lived in a very homogeneous community, and I can't discount the impact of that on our connections and what that might have meant. And in terms of my professional life, when I left home and went to college, I decided to go into higher education, and I spent the first 20 years of my career in residence life. And so I have a very uncommon, untraditional life in that I lived in the residence halls from 1982 to 2003. So over 20 years I lived in the residence halls and in various positions. And this is why I wrote about this in my dissertation, is because, and I wish I had some sort of time-lapse photography to really illustrate what happened from the time I started in res life till the time I left and the impact of technology on community. Because when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student and early in my career, the common spaces, the lounges were always full of students. The dining halls were always full of students.
Never when I was in college. Never, ever,
right.
ever.
So, and I literally watched those common spaces empty out over the course of my time in residence life, and it broke my heart. And I knew something really important was happening, and I knew it wasn't good.
So tell me, where were people? Were they in their own rooms looking at their
Yes,
computers?
because they had everything they needed in their own rooms, in their own spaces. And I can remember one night, I was the Associate Dean of Students at Linden State College up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. It no longer exists. It's now combined with another institution. But no, it does exist. It's still there, but it's a different college now. But anyway, it was early 2000s. And so we didn't even have iPhones yet, but people were still often in their own rooms, on the internet or whatever. And when I was in college, not everybody even had their own phone or their own television, so you would gather in common spaces for that. But I can remember one night the power went out, and it went out for a long time. It was 24 hours of a power outage, and the students were flipping out. And I had an office full of board games, and I went to every lounge on that campus and put board games in the common spaces, and I got candles, and I emailed all the students, and I said, go to your lounge and just play games. And I had so many students tell me in the aftermath of that it was their favorite night of their entire career.
You just said you emailed them during a power outage?
No, I somehow I got word out. That's a good point. I must not have emailed them. I think I sent the RAs around. I'm so used to saying that's the way I communicate. I probably sent the RAs around to tell them, come to the lounge.
But finish your story. Did they come?
But anyway, they came, and many of them told me it was the best night of their college career. And I think that it was because they had never experienced that kind of, it was novel to them. It was really remarkable. And right now, we're doing, I don't want to get too far into this because might require too much explanation. But as you all know, we're doing this program on campus called Project Connect, where we're having folks come together in small groups. We use a prescribed curriculum from Project Connect. Is an organization out of Northampton, Massachusetts. It was founded by Jessica Gifford, who used to work in residence life and higher education. And she developed a curriculum for connection. It's designed to work with groups of 6 to 8 people and to build relationship. And we're doing that on the GCC campus right now. And I was walking from the main building over here the other day and passed someone who had just come from the group. And her eyes were lit up. And she was like, this is one of the best things I've done since I started working here. And so I think we're hungry for that. We don't necessarily know how to get it or create it because of the ways in which our society has changed so much over the decades. But when it's offered or when it's even forced upon someone, it's so meaningful. And I as a person who got into this field because of my passion about relationship and connection, it continues as I'm kind of moving toward the end of my career to feel more important than ever, because it used to happen so organically based on, like when you live in the residence halls, you're living together, you're eating together, you're together all the time. And those relationships formed so organically. But now that nobody comes out of their room, it's not as easy. So finding ways, I think us in higher education have an opportunity and a responsibility to continue to encourage relationship between and among people who wouldn't normally encounter each other or develop those connections.
That to me, the last bit you just said, people who wouldn't otherwise perhaps encounter each other or develop relationships, is fascinating, because I think it's and it's making me think, Alex, of something you said earlier about capitalism. A few years ago, Greenfield built a new public library. Before then, for several decades, there was a very clear demonstrated need for a new public library in Greenfield. There had never been a building actually built for that purpose. It was in an old house. And so there was a lot of good reasons on paper to do it, but it had been very difficult to get the community willing to spend the money to do it or commit to it. And the arguments against it began to be tied up with political trends of the time. And so you saw the language bend in that direction, which had actually very little to do with the actual need for the library. One of the things to me that was so interesting about a public library is it's one of, and maybe the only place in town where all the members of the general public can run into one another, and there is no exchange of money. Everything is provided inside that space for use for free by each other as a part of the common good, and that we're there for another reason, and we might run into people from every walk of life or every age group, and it is unique in that way. Otherwise, you're going downtown. Used to be you went downtown to buy things you needed or wanted. Now that the retail has declined, there are just fewer of those opportunities to run into people. So as a civic space, we began to understand the value of the library to be magnified in relation to those changes.
And it's an amazing library.
It is a really good library.
And that's exactly right. I think that's what makes libraries so special. And I think why a lot of my favorite people in my life are librarians. I think there's something about people who gravitate to
that field.
Yeah, exactly. To things that are resources that everyone has the right to, And I think, just to plug the Greenfield Public Library, excellent children's space. My daughter is obsessed with it. So
that's wonderful. One of the interesting things about the library is it has a lot of meeting room space because Greenfield had not enough meeting space for folks who actually were in clubs or served on town committees. There was a constant need for people. Where could we meet? Where could we meet? So the library was built with as many of those kinds of spaces available as possible that you could sort of check out a space even. And now there are also small meeting rooms in that library, which were a new concept for me just to become familiar with, where like a group of 4 or fewer people could meet. And those I happen to be on the board of trustees of the Greenfield Public Library, for full disclosure. So I get to see the numbers of patrons who used all the different resources in the library every month because they create a report. Those meeting rooms are constantly booked.
Wow.
People need space to get together and work on projects. Some of them are school groups. Some of them are adult students who are working, like they're nurses in a class and they need to do a group project. I know I've had meetings there. Subcommittees of the trustees have met there. It's just fascinating to me that actually we need even more now spaces. People are kind of always looking for spaces to meet and gather and also have events. So another thing that we've sort of become aware of, because the library can't always provide it, is people are desperate to rent spaces for birthday parties.
Wow.
And there are not enough spaces, commercial or otherwise, for an event that's just too big for a home, or maybe you want to get 25 people together and you really can't do it in your apartment.
Right.
So that there's a desire for that, and that it's a good thing.
Maybe GCC should look at that.
Yep.
Other thoughts from the film, think like, were there moments that stood out to you, or just things that you wanted to write down and remember?
Let's see. Well, well, now of course I'm blanking, as I had been holding on to it. Oh, I think so. There was something that went unsaid in the film that kept sticking in my head, which is the U.S. government's historic role in demolishing many clubs, and like, the McCarthy era, or I think like a J. Edgar Hoover is probably more responsible for the death of like American social life or radical social life than I think a lot of the folks who the movie interviewed would be more comfortable admitting, so like I think that was like part of like a little a bit of it that I wish they would have acknowledged that there's been and that we're entering when this film was made, I think it was maybe a more hopeful year,
barely,
but like a little bit more acknowledgement of like forming a club can get you targeted. Forming a club can get you arrested. A little bit more
That's
acknowledgement
really good point.
of the people who have come before us, who have made sacrifices, based on that. And I think like that's what the movie wasn't willing to go into, and I understand why. I think this was a little bit more trying to get us thinking about our just the broader social fabric, right? And I do think that's important too. But I guess that was just one. It kept sticking in my head as I watched. So that was one little thought. And also, I wanted to come back around to talking about where all the college students are now, because I do have a little more insight in it. So I started in 2008, big state university, for first couple years of my education. I will say most folks, there was no hanging out in common rooms. It was the gym or sports. And it's not something that I was interested in. And I think, and a lot of, during one of the little rapid montages of the film, when they're showing like, they're trying to counter, Robert Putnam's thesis, like kind of early on in his, bowling alone theory. They're like, no. Like you can see like, everyone is playing soccer now. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, when they're just in different clubs now.
Yeah, they're just in different clubs. But I do think there's a fundamental difference between sports and the types of clubs that this film is talking about. Not necessarily, but I think like the club, like it's less like the actual rugby team and more like the rugby team hanging out afterward is what the movie was more focused on. And I didn't see that part of anything during my time at university, but I think that might have been me too, so I think there's plenty of clubs and resources, and people at GCC work incredibly hard to make sure that students have groups and stuff to attend to and stuff like that. So I know people are trying, but you're right. It can just be hard to get people into those common spaces to just hang out for an extended time. I don't see it as I see it more again. I see it at GCC more than I did at my time in college. So
and at GCC is not that different than other institutions. We now have almost half of our students online. which is something that, a decade ago, I would have never imagined. And I remember when distance learning was becoming a thing, and I remember thinking, this isn't going to last. This isn't going to work. And frankly, I mean, the access piece is so incredibly important, but what it's done to like relationship, because I do think learning happens best in the context of relationship. And personally, I've heard a lot of students say this just doesn't work for me, but I have to do it because I can't come in person because of A, B, or C. So I love the fact that it gives access, but I think it's impact the things that you were talking about, Alex, significantly. Because how do you engage online learners in that,
It's different,
It's a
and
real
it's a lot
challenge.
harder. It's something in workforce development. A lot of our programs are in person, and some of them are hybrid with an online component. And it's building that connection and that community of practice has become something that's really important in workforce development, partly because some of the students we serve are some of the students with the highest needs.
Right.
And we know that a community of practice where they feel that just them showing up has value to that small community will keep them engaged, and they'll have a higher success rate, but it'll also help everybody in the room
Absolutely.
feel like we have a thing to go to and to be together. There's also now, because of the pandemic, we all sort of have access to a common language around data that show that when people are in close physical proximity to each other, they have a response. Like this isn't,
Yes.
it's not something we only imagine. It is quite real to be in physical community together. So there are benefits to it, but of course, like having access to a course you would never have been able to take otherwise online is a wonderful thing.
It's important.
And where we live, where it's so rural, we have to be able to give that now, and I think that's great. But it's Alex, when you were talking about being on campus and how it can be really isolating unless you're sort of used to being on a team, in a team sport, or attracted to that. When I was an undergraduate, and I was never on a team sport. I was the kind of kid who only did horseback riding or swimming because I could do it just by myself. I wasn't great at team sports. But man, I wanted to be in the radio station. There was a radio station on my campus, and college radio used to be a huge thing for the artsy kids or the tech nerds. And then we would come together, and here we are doing a podcast, and we're actually all in the same room together, which is super cool. But one of the things that I've been worried about with some digital tools promote isolation or creation in isolation. And some of the analog tools were really great because by accident they brought us together. So I remember being in the stacks at the radio station while a friend of mine was doing his show and trying to be really quiet because I was pulling out LPs and I wanted to look at all the records, but he was literally on air like 2 feet away from me. And so, and that's just fun. And the tools are really not all that different than the ones we're using right now, but I want more of that. And now, unfortunately, radio, there's a similar decline in sort of live bootleg or small radio as there has been in small newspapers. But there is a very, very fun niche, small scale radio movement globally, and I have friends who've done really interesting work with that. But that is so niche and so small, it's hard to even find out about it.
I think creating something together is like, when I think back to the moments in my life where I felt most alive, and I actually minored in journalism in college, and so I was on the newspaper staff all through high school, and involved in newspaper work early on in my career. And so there's other ways in which I've been what I would call a creator, but I've never felt more alive than when I'm creating with other people, alongside other people. And I think there's room for solitary work too, of course, but I feel like those are the moments that stand out to me. Or even, I was thinking, when we were talking earlier, I was thinking about when a friend of mine ran for mayor of Greenfield. It was, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And we had a team that was responsible for supporting her candidacy, and we had an office downtown, and we had assigned nights to be in that office. I can remember almost every night of the week, I'd be like, well, it's not my night, but I'm going to go down there, because it was so exciting to be with a group of, we were all women, with a group of women who were trying to create change in our community and coming together for the purpose of doing so. And it took me back to college, because I often had those opportunities in college that I just haven't had since. but it was such an incredible feeling to do that with other people.
Yeah, it reminds me. It all kind of comes back in my from my world quote. Like as a musician, everything is just starting a band, right? Backyard Oasis, the podcast.
Yeah.
It's a lot like a band.
Yeah.
Everyone brings their own ideas and goals and stuff, and you have to try and wrangle personalities, and lots can happen in bands, right? And like creation and tension and stuff. And then once you have lots of small bands, you start to get a whole scene. And once you have a scene, that's when you have like a real club and a real movement. You know?
Right.
So like the music world and the sort of has always been like a real inspirational model for me. At least the independent music world has always been really inspirational for me, is how to organize. How do you get like 50 people into a basement for a show in Boston? I don't know. It's hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But people do it. It's cool.
It's the best feeling, actually, a small basement show.
Oh, it's the best.
So when I was in college, there was a healthy radio station and a really healthy, vibrant music scene. And being in proximity to that, I was never a good musician. I was a couple of times roped into being in a really bad bands, but
no such thing as a bad band.
it feels good to be on a team.
Mm-hmm.
Judy, I think that's what you were just saying, and I know I felt that in a number of places of work. I've been really lucky to serve with really good people, and it makes you want to show up and
do better.
You feel it the way you feel it in a band. I mean, musicians have to listen to each other.
Yeah, exactly. It's a conversation, right? Yeah, that's the old cliche. It's true. Yeah. Music is conversation.
When you said, Sam, it makes you want to show up, I was thinking about, and I'm not just saying this because I'm at work right now. I look forward to coming to work every day. I really I love my job, but I know a lot of people enjoy the remote work, and I, occasionally I certainly in the morning in particular, I'll often take some remote time before I come in just to get through emails or maybe do a Zoom or whatever. But I love coming here and seeing people, and I love walking around. And
what are you going to do all day? Watch TV?
Exactly. And I know that I know we probably need to wind up here, and maybe we need to do a part 2. But just what are some takeaways for you, or some moments in that film you'll never forget? What are some thoughts as we kind of wind this up? I know we've been all over the place.
I think my big takeaway is that, even with all my criticism, I think it's that self-examination of we all need to just be comfortable with being a part of something bigger than ourselves, right? We all need to start to think of ourselves, be more comfortable with being a joiner, right? Even if the word kind of makes you cringe a little bit still. I think we're going up against a lot of social conditioning when we're talking about stuff like this. And so, I do think when it comes down to it, my ultimate takeaway from it is it's it's self-examination about I think we need to be more connected. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I did something this year I'd never imagined I was going to do, and a neighbor about a year ago, started asking me if I'd be willing to join the fire department in my small town, and I had never considered doing such a thing. I had a whole bunch of reasons why I didn't think that I would be appropriate for that.
I would probably have those for myself too.
And he asked me enough times, and he wasn't kidding, that he did a masterful job of recruiting me, because for whatever reason, I began to seriously consider it, and I hadn't even really thought about that. Funny enough, I had also checked the book Bowling Alone out of the library.
Oh, wow.
And so I had Bowling Alone sitting on my bedside table waiting for me to read it, and I would dip into it a little bit at night, but I never got all the way through it. And it actually came due back at the library, so I got an email from my very small library in my very small town saying, your book's overdue. And I dropped Bowling Alone off at the library on the same day I went to my first fire department training. And I am now a firefighter on my volunteer fire department.
That's a great story.
And the great thing about it is I've met people in town I might never have met otherwise. And I've overcome a bit of my shyness. It's been fantastic for me. And I like the tech aspect of it very much. I'm not, it's a good thing to do. And I'm realizing it doesn't really even matter so much about me. I'll serve on it for as long as I can,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll stop at whatever point I need to stop. And it's just a good thing to do in town. And I'm serving with people who are much, much younger than I am, and some who are older than I am.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I think in a weird way, it decenters me and it makes me a part of something bigger than me.
And now you'll be recruiting people for the fire
Oh,
department.
I'd be very happy to recruit more
You probably
people.
do it quite effectively.
But it's just a cool thing to do. And I had no idea how cool it was. And I've actually, if I could, I don't often want to go back in time, but if I could go back into my 20s, I might just be a professional firefighter. It seems like a really cool job. So, yeah, I think one of the nicest things about living in this area, and Alex, this goes back to something you had said earlier about the magic in Greenfield. There's something about Franklin County that lets you be a lot of different versions of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even ones you didn't know about yet. And so you can organically go through that change, even very difficult transitions. Like I've been through a divorce while living here. And so, there's like this danger of running into people on the street and having to explain difficult things to them, and how are they going to respond, and how do you just get through your day. And this is an okay place to be a real person. It really is. And that there's something very magical about that, or also just good.
Well, it's kind of like when I was describing what it was like to grow up in my neighborhood, knowing who lived where and that I was safe. There's that feeling here, I think, where I kind of know where to go if I have a problem here, and they will know who I am, and I have some sort of relationship. Two of the things that I've been thinking a lot about since the film, since I watched the film, and I've watched it about 4 times now, but I didn't watch it as recently as last night, so I'm not
This morning, 4
and
a.m.
I'm older, so I
5 a.m.
forget things. But I've been thinking a lot about, and this has been part of my own personal experience, about 12-step organizations. And when you talk about join or die, you're literally talking about join or die when you talk about an organization like AA or NA. And I've been thinking a lot about how, I've always said I think 12-step principles and practices are actually the solution to all that ails us. And this notion of our fates being connected is so apparent when you all share a disease like alcoholism or drug abuse or whatever, not so apparent in the real world. And if we could sort of transfer that understanding and knowledge to the real world, how powerful that would be, that our lives literally depend upon us being in relationship with each other, our actual physical lives. So that's one thing I've been thinking a lot about is I'd love to do some more work on how do we use 12-step as a model for other things in the world. But I also, for me, the most moving part of the film, and I definitely shed a few tears, was when Robert described the arc. My friend the other day said to me, you always talk about people like they're your neighbors. you use their first names and you don't know these people. And I'm like,
your buddy Robert.
I was like, that was a great compliment. I know you meant it as an insult, but I take it as a great compliment. But when he talked about that pivotal moment when he heard JFK's speech, and when he asked not what you can do for your country, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And then he has that moment in the White House when Obama awards him with the medal where he sees the picture of JFK on the wall with his wife as a much older person. And he describes that as the arc of his life. And I thought that was so powerful because I think, my hope, working in higher education, I have so many hopes for our students. But one of my greatest hopes is that they will have. Are we having a fire alarm?
We are. We're having a fire
We
alarm.
are having a fire alarm.
Should I wrap up the spot?
We have to wrap up we got to wrap up.
So anyway, that our students would have a moment of realization that they want to use their talents and intersect with what the world needs. And that's what Robert talked about. So please join us at the Garden Theater on Monday, March 24th. Rebecca Davis, co-director, she directed with her brother Pete, will be there for a Q&A.
Thank you, everybody.
This concludes today's podcast. We're always looking for new ideas, so feel free to reach out to Judy Raper, Associate Dean of Community Engagement at Greenfield Community College at 413-775-1819 if you have an idea you'd love to share. Special thanks to the creators of Backyard Oasis, Denise Schwartz, Chad Fuller, Dennis Lee, and Christine Copeland. Have a great day.